pleased my son is freezing." The voice almost disappeared beneath the sound of wind pushing hard against the old ranch house. But Luke Brennan heard it anyway. Outside, snow fell sideways beneath the weak yellow glow of the porch light, while Colorado winter pressed cold against everything it touched. The clock near the fireplace read a little after 9 at night. Too late for visitors. Too late for company. Luke had lived alone long enough to know most unexpected knocks only brought trouble. Ranger lifted his head before Luke even stood from the chair. The 8-year-old German Shepherd had been sleeping beside the fire moments earlier, paws twitching softly in dreams only old dogs understood. But now the dog stood completely alert near the front door, ears raised, breathing slow and focused. Luke frowned. Ranger rarely reacted that way anymore. Age had softened him, slowed him. "Stay," Luke muttered while reaching for the old flannel jacket hanging near the door. The wind hit hard the moment he opened it, cold enough to sting his face immediately. Snow covered the porch in uneven drifts, and standing beneath the porch light was a woman wrapped inside a worn winter coat, far too thin for mountain weather. Beside her stood a boy, maybe 10 years old, shoulders pulled tight against the cold, holding an old backpack close to his chest like it contained everything he still trusted in the world. The woman hesitated before speaking again. "I am sorry to bother you," she said quietly. "Our car broke down about 5 miles back. We tried calling somebody, but my phone died." Her voice shook slightly, though Luke could not tell if it came from cold or embarrassment. "We do not need much," she continued carefully. "Just somewhere out of the weather for tonight." Luke glanced toward the darkness beyond the driveway. Snow covered almost everything now, the road leading through the mountains barely visible anymore beneath fresh ice and drifting wind. Dangerous conditions for anyone stranded. Still, something inside him hesitated. Years in the military taught hard lessons about trusting strangers too quickly. Life after the Navy only made him quieter, more careful, more alone. "There is a motel 20 miles south," Luke answered finally. "Might still have rooms." The woman lowered her eyes briefly. "We tried." Small pause. They were full. The boy said nothing, just stood quietly beside her without complaining, without fidgeting, without even looking uncomfortable despite the cold. Strange kid. Most children shivered, cried, or asked questions. This one only watched the snow. Luke sighed softly. "I do not let strangers stay inside." Honest answer. Easier that way. Cleaner. Less complicated. The woman nodded quickly, almost like she expected rejection already. "I understand," she whispered. "I just thought maybe." Her sentence disappeared unfinished. Then something unusual happened. Ranger moved. The old German Shepherd stepped past Luke before he could stop him and walked straight toward the woman and the boy. Luke tensed automatically. Ranger had military training. Even retired, instincts stayed close beneath the surface. But instead of barking or keeping distance, Ranger stopped directly in front of the child. Quiet. Still. Watching. The boy slowly looked down. "Hey there," he whispered softly. No fear. No hesitation. Ranger lowered his head slightly, sniffed once near the boy's jacket, then sat down beside him. Calm. Like he had already made up his mind about something Luke did not understand yet. Luke frowned harder. "That is strange," he muttered quietly. Ranger almost never approached strangers first anymore. Especially not children. Since retirement, the dog usually stayed close to Luke and ignored everyone else. But now the German Shepherd remained beside the boy as though protecting him from the cold itself. The woman noticed too. "He likes dogs," she said quietly. "Always has." Luke crossed his arms against the cold. Snow continued collecting on the porch railing while distant wind moved through pine trees surrounding the ranch. The storm was getting worse. Roads would be impossible by midnight. He looked again at the boy. Thin gloves. Cheap sneakers already wet from snow. Backpack held tight against his chest. Something about that picture settled heavier than expected inside Luke's chest. Memories maybe. Old loneliness recognizing new loneliness. "I have a barn," Luke said finally. "It is heated enough to stay warm." Relief crossed the woman's face so quickly it almost hurt to look at. "Thank you," she whispered immediately. "Really? Just one night?" Luke nodded once. "There is an old cot in the storage room. Blankets too." Still, Ranger did not move. The dog stayed sitting beside the boy, calm and strangely focused. The boy finally smiled for the first time. Small smile. Careful smile. "What is his name?" he asked quietly. "Ranger," Luke answered. The boy nodded slowly. I think he already knows me. Something about the way he said it felt oddly certain, like he meant more than simple friendliness. Luke opened the barn doors an hour later, while cold wind swept snow across the floorboards. The woman introduced herself quietly as Claire Whitmore. Her son was Eli. They thanked him too many times for blankets and hot soup. Ranger followed them inside without being called. Strange again. Stranger still when the dog refused to leave Eli's side afterward. Luke stood near the doorway watching while Claire settled onto the old cot, and Eli sat quietly nearby holding his backpack. Ranger curled beside the boy instead of returning toward the ranch house like usual. Luke frowned toward the old dog. You staying here? Ranger barely looked at him, just lowered his head beside Eli's boots like he had somewhere important to be. Then the boy said something soft enough Luke almost missed it. This place feels sad, Eli whispered quietly while looking toward the far corner of the barn. Like somebody cried here for a really long time. Luke froze where he stood, because nobody should have known that corner mattered at all. Not unless somehow they already knew what Luke spent years trying to forget. Luke Brennan stood frozen near the barn doorway long after Eli stopped speaking. Outside, snow continued falling hard enough to soften every sound across the ranch, wrapping the mountains in that strange winter silence only Colorado seemed to understand. Inside the barn, old wood creaked quietly while wind pushed gently against the walls. Luke looked toward the corner Eli had pointed at without meaning to. A stack of forgotten boxes sat there beneath dusty blankets and old tools nobody touched anymore. Ordinary to anyone else, but not to Luke. Not after all these years. Because that corner had once belonged to someone who no longer existed in the world except through memory. His wife, Emma, used to sit there on cold nights wrapped in blankets drinking coffee while he repaired tack or worked late in the barn. After cancer took her 6 winters ago, Luke locked away more than grief. He locked away whole parts of himself. The barn became storage. The ranch became quieter. Life became smaller. What made you say that? Luke asked carefully. Eli shrugged without looking nervous. I do not know, the boy answered softly. It just feels sad over there. He hugged his backpack tighter. Like somebody missed somebody. Luke glanced toward Claire. She looked equally uncomfortable. I am sorry, she said quickly. He says strange things sometimes. But Ranger had not moved. That bothered Luke most. The German shepherd stayed curled beside Eli's feet like he belonged there. No pacing. No checking on Luke. No quiet walk back toward the house like every other night. Just stillness. Calm focus. Almost protective. Strange enough to feel wrong. Get some sleep, Luke muttered finally. Storm will probably clear by morning. Claire nodded gratefully. Thank you again, she said softly. Luke only gave a short nod before heading back toward the ranch house, though something unsettled followed him through the snow. The kind of feeling that refused to explain itself. Inside, the fire still glowed softly near the couch. Warm air wrapped around him, but sleep stayed far away. He poured coffee instead, though it was already too late for caffeine to make sense. Old habits did not always care about logic. Through the kitchen window, he could barely see the barn lights glowing faintly through snowfall. Usually Ranger would scratch at the front door by now wanting inside. Not tonight. Luke frowned and checked the clock. Nearly 11. Still nothing. What are you doing out there? He muttered quietly. Somewhere around midnight, curiosity finally won. Luke grabbed his coat and flashlight and crossed the snowy yard toward the barn again. Wind had calmed some now, though cold still bit hard enough to sting exposed skin. When he opened the barn door, warm air drifted toward him carrying the smell of hay and old wood. Claire slept quietly beneath thick blankets on the cot, but Eli remained awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor near Ranger. The dog rested beside him, eyes half open, calm as ever. Could not sleep? Luke asked. Eli looked up slowly. Not really. Luke noticed something strange then. The backpack sat open beside the boy. Inside looked less like belongings and more like pieces of a life packed too quickly. Old books, folded papers, a worn stuffed animal nearly too small for someone his age. Nothing expensive, nothing unusual, just sadness somehow folded into ordinary things. Storm scared you? Luke asked. Eli shook his head. No, small pause. Moving around scares me more. Luke frowned slightly, but did not push. Children carried things adults rarely saw right away. Ranger shifted closer against Eli's shoulder, and for a second Luke almost laughed quietly. The dog had not leaned against anyone except him in years. He usually does not like strangers, Luke admitted. Eli smiled softly. I think he just gets lonely. The sentence landed harder than expected. Luke looked toward Ranger. Toward the old dog resting quietly beside a boy he met only hours ago. Maybe loneliness recognized loneliness faster than people did. Well, Luke muttered quietly. He has good company then. Eli looked toward the far corner again. Same corner. Did somebody used to sing here? He asked suddenly. Luke stopped moving. Completely. Cold feelings settling deeper than winter. Why would you ask that? Eli shrugged again. I do not know. Quiet pause. It just feels like somebody used to sing when things were hard. Luke swallowed once. Emma used to sing there while pretending cold nights felt less lonely. Same corner. Same place. Nobody knew that except him. Nobody. Before he could answer, Ranger stood suddenly and walked closer toward Eli's backpack. The dog lowered his head and sniffed carefully near one side pocket before sitting beside it again. Focused now. Watching. Almost like something inside mattered more than the bag itself. Luke frowned harder. Strange behavior. Very strange. And if you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss more heartfelt stories like this one. Eli noticed Ranger staring at the backpack too. He keeps doing that, the boy said softly. Luke crossed his arms slowly. What is in there? Eli hesitated for the first time all night, then quietly answered, just stuff from home. But something about the way he said it felt incomplete. Outside, wind brushed softly against the barn walls while snow continued falling beneath mountain darkness. Inside, Ranger never once looked away from the old backpack. Morning arrived quieter than Luke Brennan expected. Snow still covered the ranch in thick, uneven layers, softening the fences and hiding the gravel road beneath smooth white drifts. Sunlight stretched weakly through clouds while cold air hung heavy over the mountains. Usually mornings felt predictable here. Coffee near the fireplace. Ranger waiting near the porch. Silence stretching long enough to feel normal. But today felt different before Luke even opened his eyes. Because Ranger had not scratched at the front door once during the night. Strange enough to wake old instincts Luke thought retirement had buried years ago. He pulled on boots and stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs, cold immediately biting through his jacket. The barn stood quiet beneath pale morning light, while smoke drifted softly from the ranch house chimney behind him. Inside, warmth lingered from the old heater Luke barely trusted anymore. Claire sat awake on the cot, holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands like warmth alone might solve problems she did not want to name. Eli still slept curled beneath blankets, though Ranger remained beside him exactly where Luke left him hours earlier. The German shepherd barely glanced toward Luke before settling again near the boy. That alone felt wrong. Ranger never ignored morning routines. Never. He slept there all night, Claire said quietly. Luke nodded slowly. He usually sleeps inside. Claire offered an apologetic smile. Sorry if we messed up his habits. Not his habits, Luke answered carefully. Just unusual. Claire lowered her eyes again. Tired eyes. The kind people carried after too many difficult months. Luke recognized that look. Military life taught people how exhaustion settled into bones before faces ever admitted it. Roads should clear by noon, he said finally. Tow truck might reach your car after that. Claire nodded but did not look relieved. Something heavy stayed behind her expression, like somebody carrying too many worries alone for too long. Eli stirred quietly, then sat up slower than most children his age, immediately checking for Ranger before fully waking. The dog lifted his head gently and nudged closer, like they had known each other much longer than 12 hours. Morning, Eli whispered softly while rubbing sleep from his eyes. Luke handed over warm pancakes and eggs a little later inside the ranch kitchen. Nobody talked much at first. Wind tapped softly against windows while snow melted slowly from the porch roof outside. Ranch life always made silence feel less uncomfortable somehow. Eli sat near Ranger on the floor instead of at the table, sharing tiny pieces of bacon beneath Luke's quiet disapproval. You are spoiling him, Luke muttered. Eli smiled slightly. I think he deserves it. Ranger stayed close enough that Luke almost laughed quietly. The dog had spent years keeping emotional distance from strangers after military retirement. Yet now he followed Eli from room to room like somebody protecting family. After breakfast, Luke stepped toward the barn planning to check frozen pipes. Ranger immediately stood and followed him. So did Eli. Can I help? The boy asked quietly. Luke hesitated before nodding once. You know anything about ranch work? Eli shrugged. Not really. Small pause. But I can carry stuff. The barn felt colder in daylight. Dust floated through thin beams of winter sun slipping between wooden boards. Somewhere above them, old metal shifted softly beneath warming temperatures. Luke worked quietly near the tool bench while Eli wandered slowly through the barn, backpack still close by. Ranger followed him instead of Luke. Watching, waiting, almost studying him. Then something happened again. Eli stopped near the far corner of the barn. Same corner. Same place from last night. This room still feels sad, he whispered softly. Luke looked up immediately. Kid, he muttered carefully. You keep saying things you should not know. Eli looked confused more than frightened. I am sorry, he said quietly. Sometimes I just feel stuff. Luke frowned toward the old storage door hidden behind stacked boxes. Locked for years now. After Emma died, he stopped opening it completely. Easier that way. Less remembering. Less pain. Ranger suddenly moved before Luke said another word. The German shepherd walked directly toward the old storage door and scratched once. Slow. Deliberate. Then again. Harder this time. Luke stared. Ranger. The dog scratched again. Focused now. Intentional. Eli looked up quietly. I think he wants you to open it. Luke crossed his arms tighter. Nothing in there matters anymore. But Ranger did not move. One soft whine escaped his throat before he pressed closer to the door. Strange behavior. Stranger still when Eli stepped quietly beside him. I do not think he likes leaving things forgotten, the boy said softly. Luke swallowed harder than expected. Because 6 years ago Emma said almost the exact same thing while cleaning the ranch house one cold February morning. Same words. Same quiet tone. Nobody knew that memory except him. Wind pushed softly against the barn walls while snow slid from the roof outside in heavy muffled sounds. Ranger scratched again, this time refusing to stop. Luke looked toward the locked door longer than he wanted to, then finally reached into his jacket pocket where an old rusted key still waited after all these years. He had not touched it since the funeral. Not once. Fine, Luke muttered quietly. One look. But just as he stepped closer, Ranger turned suddenly and walked toward Eli's backpack again, nose pressed carefully near one side pocket before staring back at Luke like something connected mattered more than he understood yet. Luke Brennan stood in front of the old storage room door longer than he wanted to admit. Dust clung to the metal handle. The wood around the frame had darkened with age, years of cold winters quietly settling into every crack. 6 years. 6 years since he touched this part of the barn. 6 years since grief convinced him forgetting hurt less than remembering. Ranger sat quietly near Eli's backpack again, eyes shifting between Luke and the locked room as though somehow both things mattered equally. The old German shepherd looked patient but stubborn, a look Luke knew too well from military days. You really are not letting this go, are you? Luke muttered softly. Ranger only blinked once. Eli stood nearby hugging his backpack close, quiet as ever. The boy did not look excited or curious the way most children would. If anything, he looked thoughtful, careful, like he already understood some rooms carried memories people did not want touched. Luke pulled the rusted key from his coat pocket and turned it slowly between his fingers. Cold metal. Familiar weight. Too many years passed without purpose. He almost put it back. Almost walked away again. But then Ranger stood and moved directly beside him. Close enough for Luke to feel warm breath against his leg. Waiting. Fine. Luke whispered quietly, mostly to himself. The lock resisted at first. Metal scraping, old metal. Then finally gave way with a dull, heavy click. The sound echoed softly through the barn. Nobody moved for a second. Even the wind outside felt quieter somehow. Luke pushed the door open slowly. Dust floated through thin winter sunlight spilling from the barn windows. Inside sat a room frozen in time. Old shelves leaned against one wall, filled with forgotten tools and stacked boxes. A faded quilt rested over an old wooden chair. In the far corner stood Emma's record player, still covered by a thin layer of dust. Luke swallowed hard. He had forgotten how small the room really was. Or maybe grief simply made things feel farther away than they ever were. Eli stepped carefully behind him without speaking. Ranger followed close. Calm. Focused. Luke moved toward the chair slowly, eyes lingering on things he stopped allowing himself to remember. Emma's gardening gloves still hanging near the window. Old coffee mugs stacked carelessly. A half-finished birdhouse project she always promised to finish one spring. There never came another spring for her. She liked this room, Eli said quietly. Luke stopped immediately. What? Eli looked around softly. The lady. Small pause. She liked listening to music here. Luke felt cold move through him despite the heated barn. How would you know that? The boy hesitated. I do not know, he admitted honestly. Sometimes places just feel loud, even when nobody is talking. Luke looked away quickly, uncomfortable in ways he could not explain. Emma used to play old country records while cleaning the barn because she hated silence. Nobody knew that except him. Nobody should know. Before Luke could ask another question, Ranger suddenly moved toward an old filing cabinet pushed halfway beneath shelves in the back corner. The dog nudged it once with his nose. Then again, more insistently. Luke frowned. What now? Ranger pawed softly near the bottom drawer. Strange again. Everything today felt strange. Luke crouched slowly and pulled the drawer open. Mostly old receipts. Ranch paperwork. Dust-covered envelopes. Nothing important. But beneath everything sat an old wooden box he did not remember seeing before. Small. Worn edges. Locked once, but now barely holding together. Luke lifted it carefully. I have never seen this, he muttered. Eli looked quietly interested, but said nothing. Inside sat folded letters tied together with faded twine, photographs yellowed by time, and something else beneath them. An old envelope with Luke's father's handwriting across the front. Luke froze completely. He had not seen that handwriting since the funeral more than 15 years ago. Hands suddenly unsteady, he opened the envelope slowly. The paper inside looked fragile with age. Luke read the first line once. Then again, because somehow it did not make sense. If anything ever happens to me before I make things right, find Thomas Whitmore. He saved my life when nobody else could. Luke frowned deeply. Whitmore. The name landed strangely familiar somehow. Behind him, Claire suddenly stopped moving. Completely. Luke turned slowly. She stood near the doorway holding folded blankets, face pale enough to worry him. Whitmore. Luke asked carefully. That name means something to you? Claire looked stunned. Quiet. Almost shaken. That was my grandfather's last name, she said softly. Silence settled hard between them. Even Eli looked up now. Ranger stood quietly near the old box as though this was exactly what he wanted found all along. Luke unfolded the next letter slower this time. More handwriting. More mentions of land agreements, promises, and debts never repaid. Then one sentence caught him completely off guard. One day, if you ever meet his family, help them the way he helped ours. Luke looked back toward Claire. Toward Eli. Toward the family who somehow arrived at his barn during the worst snowstorm of the year. Outside, wind pushed softly through pine trees while sunlight settled across old dust, like time itself had quietly waited for somebody to come back. Ranger sat beside the wooden box and looked directly at Luke. Calm. Certain. Like somehow the old dog already knew none of this happened by accident. The rest of the afternoon settled into a strange kind of quiet Luke Brennan had not felt in years. Snow slowly slid from the barn roof outside, while weak sunlight stretched across frozen ground, turning everything soft and pale. Inside the ranch house, warmth from the fireplace wrapped around old wood and silence the way winter always seemed to do here. But today the silence felt different. Less empty somehow. Claire sat near the kitchen table holding one of the letters Luke found, reading carefully while Eli quietly worked on a puzzle Ranger had somehow decided belonged to both of them now. The old German shepherd stayed so close to the boy that Luke barely recognized him anymore. Ranger had spent years keeping distance from strangers. Since retirement, the dog tolerated people more than trusted them. Yet somehow, after one night, he followed Eli room to room as though protecting something fragile. Luke stood near the sink rinsing coffee mugs when Claire finally spoke again. I should probably explain some things, she said quietly. Luke looked over but said nothing. Claire hesitated, fingers wrapped tightly around the warm mug in front of her. We were not exactly headed anywhere, she admitted softly. Not anymore. Eli kept his eyes on the puzzle pieces while Ranger rested beside him, head across the boy's boots. My husband passed away 2 years ago, Claire continued. Heart condition. Quiet pause. After that, everything started falling apart. Luke leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. Not judging, just listening. People talk differently when somebody stopped trying to fix everything immediately. Medical bills, Claire said softly. Then legal problems with family over property my husband left behind. Her voice shook slightly, though she tried hiding it. My brother-in-law said the house legally belonged to him too. She looked embarrassed admitting any of it. We lost almost everything. Luke frowned slightly. You went through court? Claire nodded once. For months. Tired smile that never fully reached her eyes. Turns out grief gets expensive. Luke understood more than he expected. Different reasons. Same loneliness. After Emma died, he buried himself in ranch work because standing still hurt too much. Silence felt dangerous back then. Empty houses remembered too much. So where were you heading? Luke asked quietly. Claire looked down at her coffee. I honestly do not know. Honest answer. Honest enough to hurt a little. Eli finally spoke without looking up. Mom said maybe we would figure it out after winter. Ranger gently nudged closer against the boy's shoulder. Luke looked away toward the snowy field outside the window. Ranch life taught patience, but it also taught hard truths. Winter did not care about people with nowhere to go, especially families, especially children. Before he could say anything, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Alert again. Focused. Same look from yesterday. Without warning, the dog stood and walked directly toward the back door, scratching softly once. Luke frowned. Neat outside. Ranger glanced back only briefly before walking toward the barn instead. Intentional. Like he wanted something. Eli noticed immediately. He wants to show us something. Luke almost laughed quietly. He is a dog. But Ranger scratched again at the door, waiting. Persistent now. Same stubborn look he carried during military training years ago. Luke sighed and grabbed his coat. Fine. Cold air hit hard outside again, though softer than yesterday. Snow crunched beneath boots as they crossed toward the barn together. Ranger moved ahead, tail low but purposeful. Straight toward the backside of the barn, near the old fence line Luke barely visited anymore. The dog stopped suddenly beside frozen ground near an old wooden post and began pawing carefully through snow. Once, twice, then harder. Luke frowned. What are you doing? Ranger kept digging. Eli stepped closer quietly. He keeps doing this, the boy said softly. He watches this spot. Luke crossed his arms. There is nothing out here. But Ranger refused to stop. Dirt slowly appeared beneath snow despite frozen ground. Focused now. Determined. Same look Luke remembered from search work overseas. Dogs only acted that way when instincts mattered. Claire wrapped her coat tighter nearby. Do you think he smells something? Luke hesitated. Maybe. But something deeper settled uncomfortably inside him. Because Ranger had only worked this hard when he believed something important waited beneath the surface. After several minutes, the dog suddenly stopped and looked directly at Luke. Waiting. Luke crouched reluctantly and brushed away packed snow himself. Something solid hit beneath frozen dirt. Metal. He frowned harder and cleared more carefully until edges appeared beneath soil. A small rusted metal box buried deeper than accident should allow. Claire stepped closer. What is that? Luke lifted it slowly. Heavy. Old. Weathered by years underground. Ranger sat quietly beside him like the work was finally done. Eli smiled softly for the first time all day. I think he found what he wanted. Luke turned the rusted box carefully in his hands, heart suddenly beating harder for reasons he could not explain. Because somehow this felt connected. To the letters. To Claire. To everything Ranger refused to ignore. And written faintly across one rusted corner, barely visible beneath years of dirt, sat initials Luke had not seen since childhood. T.B. Luke Brennan turned the rusted metal box slowly in his hands while cold air settled around the four of them like winter itself had stopped to watch. Snow clung to the edges of Ranger's fur, though the old German shepherd looked strangely satisfied now, sitting beside the hole he had dug with quiet certainty. The faded initials scratched into one corner of the box pulled at something deep inside Luke's memory. T.B. Thomas Brennan. His father. Luke had not spoken that name out loud in years. That was your dad? Claire asked softly. Luke nodded once without looking up. Thomas Brennan, he said quietly. Nobody called him Thomas except legal paperwork. He swallowed once. Everybody called him Tom. Eli crouched beside Ranger, eyes moving carefully between Luke and the box. So why was it buried, he asked. Honest question. Hard question. Luke wished he already had an answer. I do not know, he admitted. But if my father buried something out here, he had a reason. Wind pushed lightly through nearby pine trees, while sunlight stretched lower against the snow. Winter afternoons disappeared quickly in the mountains. Luke stood slowly. Let us take this inside. Back in the ranch kitchen, warmth from the fireplace slowly melted the cold from everyone's clothes. Ranger settled near Eli again immediately, head resting across the boy's feet like he belonged nowhere else now. Claire quietly made tea without asking permission, small movements careful and respectful, as though she still expected this kindness to disappear unexpectedly. Luke placed the rusted box carefully on the kitchen table beneath warm overhead light. The metal latch resisted at first. Old age, rust, forgotten years refusing to open easily. Then finally, with gentle pressure, it gave way. Inside sat neatly folded papers wrapped carefully inside oilcloth. Old photographs. A silver pocket watch Luke immediately recognized from childhood. And beneath everything else, an envelope marked simply in his father's handwriting. For the family of Thomas Whitmore. Silence filled the kitchen completely. Claire slowly lowered her teacup. Whitmore, she whispered again, almost unable to believe the name herself. Luke opened the envelope carefully, paper brittle with age. His father's handwriting moved across the page unevenly but clearly. If this letter is ever found, it means life got ahead of me before I made things right. Thomas Whitmore saved my life during deployment when I should not have survived. I promised him something if I ever got home. A place his family would never lose if they ever needed help. Luke stopped reading for a moment. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller somehow. Warmer. He looked toward Claire, who now sat completely still, eyes wide, and wet though she fought to stay composed. Eli leaned quietly against Ranger without fully understanding yet. Luke continued reading. I purchased extra acreage beside the ranch years ago with plans to transfer it legally to the Whitmore family one day. But time slipped away faster than expected. If my son finds this one day, I hope he finishes what I could not. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Only the sound of wood softly cracking in the fireplace. Outside, wind brushed gently against frozen windows. My grandfather, Claire said quietly after a long silence, used to tell stories about a man from the military who never forgot him. Small sad smile crossed her face. We always thought it was just something old people said. Luke leaned back slowly in his chair. Too many things suddenly connected in ways logic struggled to explain. The snowstorm, the knock at his door, Ranger refusing to leave Eli, the letters, the hidden room, the buried box. Almost impossible to ignore how strangely everything aligned. Then Eli quietly said something that made Luke pause again. Maybe Ranger knew. Luke almost smiled despite himself. Knew what? Eli gently scratched behind Ranger's ears. That we were supposed to come here. The old German shepherd lifted his head slowly and looked toward Luke with those calm amber eyes that somehow always seemed older than dogs should have. Ranger had done impossible things before. Military work taught Luke not to underestimate instinct. Still, this felt different. Quieter somehow, like fate moving slowly instead of loudly. Luke unfolded more papers inside the box. Property maps, legal deeds, county records. One document immediately stood out. Additional ranch acreage never officially transferred after Thomas Brennan's death. Nearly 30 extra acres connected directly to Luke's property. Valuable land. More than Luke ever knew existed. He frowned. This should have gone through probate years ago, he muttered quietly. Claire looked worried now. We are not trying to take anything, she said quickly. We really did not know any of this. Luke looked up immediately. I know. Honest answer. He believed her. Strange thing was, he trusted that feeling. Trusted Ranger too. Outside, evening slowly settled across the mountains while snow reflected soft blue light against the ranch. The kind of evening that usually felt lonely here. Empty. But tonight something felt different. Less hollow somehow. Eli quietly looked around the kitchen. This place feels warmer now, he whispered. Luke almost answered automatically, then stopped. Because somehow, against all logic, the boy was right. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the front window, watching softly as dusk settled outside. Come again now. No urgency. No searching. Like maybe, after all this time, he had finally found exactly what he came looking for. Snow melted slowly over the next 2 days, dripping from the barn roof in steady rhythms that somehow made the ranch feel alive again. Winter still held tight to the Colorado mountains, But sunlight lasted longer now, stretching warm gold across frozen fences and pine trees that no longer looked quite so lonely. Luke Brennan noticed the difference before he admitted it to himself. The ranch sounded different. Softer somehow. Less empty. Mornings no longer began with silence stretching too wide around him. Now there was the sound of coffee being poured by somebody besides himself. Quiet footsteps moving through the kitchen. Eli asking questions about tractors he clearly did not understand. Ranger following the boy so closely it felt almost impossible to remember life before it happened. The old German shepherd barely left Eli's side anymore. Not even for Luke. And strangely, Luke found he did not mind. On the third morning after the storm, Luke sat at the kitchen table surrounded by old documents from the rusted box, while sunlight drifted across faded maps and county records. Ranger rested beside Eli near the fireplace while the boy quietly worked through one of Emma's forgotten puzzle sets, as if he had always belonged there. Claire stood near the sink staring out the window, coffee untouched in her hands. Tired eyes. Worried thoughts. Luke had learned enough over the past few days to recognize both. Roads are clear now, Claire said softly without turning around. The sentence landed heavier than she probably intended. Luke looked up slowly. Yeah, he answered quietly. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just difficult. Like both people already knew something neither wanted to say first. Claire finally turned toward him. We should probably leave soon. Eli looked up immediately. Ranger lifted his head too. Luke said nothing at first. Outside, cold wind moved softly through the trees while sunlight reflected across snow like glass. Rationally, he understood. They were strangers. Temporary people passing through. Life did not suddenly become family because of coincidence and old letters. Still, something inside him resisted the thought harder than expected. You have somewhere to go? Luke asked carefully. Claire hesitated too long before answering. Not really. Honest again. But we cannot stay here forever. Luke looked down at the paperwork scattered across the table. Land deeds. Letters. His father's unfinished promise sitting quietly between them like unfinished business time somehow forgot. Maybe forever is not the question, he said finally. Claire frowned slightly. What does that mean? Before Luke answered, his phone buzzed across the table. Unknown local number. He nearly ignored it. Nearly let it ring out. But something told him not to. Luke Brennan, he answered quietly. Static first. Then an older voice. This is Harold Jensen from County Property Records. Luke sat straighter immediately. Harold knew his father years ago. You called about those old acreage documents? The man continued. I checked the records. Small pause. Papers moving somewhere in the background. Luke, looks like nobody ever processed the transfer after your father passed. Luke frowned deeper. Meaning what exactly? Meaning, Harold said slowly. Those 30 acres legally still connect to your ranch. Silence. And if these documents are valid, your father had already paid taxes on them years before he died. Luke glanced toward Claire without fully meaning to. There is more, Harold added. That land sits near spring water access. Another pause. Property value is much higher than people thought. Luke leaned back slowly. None of this felt real. 30 acres. Valuable land. A forgotten promise buried for decades. Strange enough already. Strangers still considering who somehow arrived during the biggest storm of the year, asking only for shelter. You all right? Harold asked. Luke rubbed a hand slowly across his face. Yeah, he answered quietly. Just processing. After the call ended, silence filled the kitchen again. Claire noticed his expression immediately. Bad news? She asked softly. Luke shook his head once. Actually, he looked down toward the old letters again. Toward his father's handwriting waiting patiently across faded paper. Maybe the opposite. He explained carefully. The acreage. The records. The unfinished transfer. Claire listened quietly before shaking her head almost immediately. Luke, no. Firm voice this time. We cannot take anything from you. It is not mine, Luke answered softly. Maybe it was never supposed to be. Eli looked up slowly from the floor. What does that mean? Luke hesitated before answering. Hard thing to explain to a 10-year-old. Means my dad made a promise a long time ago, he said quietly. And maybe nobody ever finished it. Claire looked overwhelmed now. Luke, we barely know each other. Honest statement. Fair statement. Still, Ranger suddenly stood and walked directly toward Claire before resting quietly beside her chair. Calm. Certain. like he disagreed with the idea of distance entirely. Eli smiled softly watching him. I think Ranger already decided. Luke almost laughed quietly despite everything. Then Claire looked toward the window for a long moment before speaking again, voice softer now. Maybe we should leave before this gets complicated. Luke stared at the snow outside too. Quiet ranch. Quiet kitchen. First time in years the house did not feel haunted by silence. First time grief loosened even a little. Finally, he answered quietly. Maybe complicated is not always bad. But late that evening, after everyone went quiet, Luke noticed something strange. Claire sat alone near the barn packing bags she had not mentioned to anyone. And beside her, Ranger sat awake in the doorway refusing to move. Luke Brennan stood quietly in the barn doorway long after sunset, cold air brushing softly against his coat, while distant wind moved through dark pine trees surrounding the ranch. The old lantern near the barn wall cast warm shadows across the floor, soft enough to make everything feel quieter than it really was. Claire sat near the cot, carefully folding clothes into worn travel bags. She clearly hoped nobody noticed. Slow movements. Careful movements. The kind people made when leaving before attachment became dangerous. Ranger sat directly between her and the open barn doors, calm but unmoving. Watching. Waiting. Luke crossed his arms loosely. You planning on leaving without saying goodbye? Claire froze for half a second before looking up. Tired smile. Guilty smile. I was going to tell you in the morning. Honest enough. Luke nodded once and stepped farther inside. Roads are not great at night. Claire looked down again. That is not really the reason. Silence settled gently around them. Somewhere nearby, snow slipped from the roof with a soft, heavy sound. Eli slept already beneath thick blankets, one hand resting near Ranger's old leash like somehow he trusted the dog would still be there by morning. Claire lowered another sweater into the bag. Luke, she said quietly, you have already done more than enough. She hesitated. You gave us shelter when nobody else would. Small pause. But this, she glanced toward the house where paperwork and old letters still sat waiting on the kitchen table. This is too much. Luke leaned quietly against the barn wall. What exactly is too much? All of it. Her voice softened further. The land. The promise. Staying. She looked embarrassed even saying it. People do not just let strangers become part of their lives. Luke almost answered automatically, then stopped. Because the truth was, he had spent years making sure nobody became part of his life. Easier after loss. Easier after grief hollowed out familiar rooms until memories became louder than conversations. Yet somehow, over just a few days, things changed in ways he did not know how to explain. The house felt warmer. Mornings felt shorter. Silence felt smaller. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward Claire, gently resting his head against her knee. Quiet. Certain. Like disagreement wrapped in kindness. Claire laughed softly despite herself and scratched behind his ears. You are not helping, she whispered to him. Luke watched the old German shepherd carefully. Ranger never forced affection, never insisted on closeness. But tonight the dog stayed planted firmly beside Claire like he understood something Luke had not said yet. He does not want you leaving, Luke said quietly. Claire smiled sadly. Dogs do not understand complicated things. Luke glanced toward Ranger, toward Eli sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Maybe weeks. Actually, he answered softly. I think he understands more than people sometimes. Silence again. Comfortable this time. Honest. Luke looked out toward the snowy field beyond the barn. Moonlight reflected across frozen ground, turning everything silver and still. You know, he said quietly, this place used to feel too quiet. Claire looked toward him carefully. Emma used to hate silence. First time he said his wife's name aloud in days. Maybe longer. She would play old records in the barn just because empty spaces bothered her. Small smile crossed his face unexpectedly. She used to say lonely places need noise. Claire listened quietly. No interruption. No fixing. Just listening. Luke appreciated that more than expected. After she died, he continued softly, I stopped opening rooms. Stopped inviting people in. He glanced toward Eli. Stopped expecting anybody to stay. Claire looked down at the floorboards. Loss changes people. Honest statement. Quiet understanding. Luke nodded once. Yeah. Then after a long pause he added, but maybe staying changes people too. Claire looked up slowly. Confused at first. Then quieter somehow. Luke rubbed a hand against the back of his neck. Words always felt harder than silence. You said you do not know where to go. He hesitated. I am saying maybe you do not have to figure that out tonight. Claire blinked slowly. Luke, I am not talking about forever, he said quickly. Just small pause. Honest pause. Long enough to breathe. Ranger gently leaned closer against Claire again, like somehow approving the idea. Eli stirred quietly in his sleep and mumbled something soft nobody quite understood before settling again beneath blankets. Claire looked toward him for a long moment, then toward the ranch house, glowing warmly through the dark. Snow outside. Fire waiting inside. Shelter. Safety. Things survival slowly taught people not to trust too quickly. You barely know us, she whispered. Luke looked toward Ranger instead. Apparently he thinks that is enough. Claire laughed softly for the first time all day. Small laugh. Real laugh. I think your dog runs this ranch. Luke smiled quietly. More than I care to admit. The wind softened outside. Winter settling calmer now. Somewhere in the distance an owl called softly through the trees. Claire slowly pushed one of the packed bags aside instead of closing it. Tiny decision. Small enough nobody else would notice. But Luke noticed. Ranger noticed too. The old German shepherd immediately curled down near the cot again like the matter had finally been settled. Before heading back toward the house, Luke paused near the barn door. Breakfast at 7, he said quietly. Pancakes if the kid still likes them. Claire looked surprised, then softly answered, I think he would like that. Luke nodded once and stepped outside into cold mountain air, feeling something unfamiliar settle quietly inside him. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of something close. And inside the barn, for the first time in years, Ranger finally slept peacefully beside people who no longer felt entirely like strangers. Spring arrived slowly in the Colorado mountains, the kind of quiet arrival people only noticed after winter finally loosened its grip. Snow melted into narrow streams beside old fences. Pine trees stood greener again, and mornings no longer carried the same sharp cold that once settled heavily across Luke Brennan's ranch. Things changed in ways Luke never planned for. Small changes first. The kind people almost missed if they were not paying attention. Extra boots near the front door. More coffee cups left beside the sink. Laughter drifting softly through the kitchen before sunrise. Ranger sleeping somewhere other than beside Luke's bed. Though strangely, that last part never bothered him the way he expected. Most mornings now, Luke woke to the sound of Eli already outside following Ranger through the property, pretending every ordinary ranch chore carried secret importance. Feeding chickens became missions. Fence repairs became adventures. Even stacking firewood somehow turned into competition. I carried more than yesterday, Eli proudly announced one morning while dragging wood nearly too big for him. Ranger walked beside him patiently, occasionally nudging crooked pieces back into place with his nose, as if supervising mattered deeply. Luke leaned against the porch railing with coffee warming his hands, and found himself smiling before realizing he had done it. Something impossible only months ago. Claire noticed too. She stood beside him quietly one morning, sunlight warming her face, while spring wind moved gently through nearby trees. He laughs more now, she said softly while watching Eli chase Ranger across the yard. Luke nodded once. Dog deserves most of the credit. Claire smiled faintly. I think maybe somebody else helped too. Luke did not answer immediately. Some things still felt easier carried quietly. County paperwork moved slower than mountain weather, but eventually the property records settled exactly where Thomas Brennan intended all those years ago. The additional acreage transferred legally under shared ownership tied to both families, just as the old letters described. Luke argued against making it complicated. Claire argued harder against taking too much. Eventually, they settled somewhere in the middle. Honest compromise. Quiet kindness. Enough land for stability. Enough work to build something real. Enough reason to stay. By early April, the old barn changed too. The same place that once held grief now held something warmer. Luke fixed broken windows. Claire helped organize and used rooms into temporary spaces for travelers who sometimes passed through the mountains needing shelter. Nothing formal, just practical kindness. Word spread quietly through nearby towns. If weather turned dangerous or someone needed somewhere safe for a few nights, Luke Brennan's ranch usually found room. No questions asked. Ranger somehow became the unofficial greeter, sitting near the barn entrance like an old soldier who finally traded missions for something gentler. Eli called him Chief of Security, which Ranger seemed oddly proud of. One warm afternoon, nearly 4 months after the snowstorm changed everything, Luke found Eli sitting near the old barn doorway painting a wooden sign carefully across his knees. Ranger rested nearby beneath sunlight, muzzle grayer now than before, but eyes still calm and watchful. "What are you making?" Luke asked quietly. Eli looked up with paint smudged lightly across one sleeve. "A sign." Small pause. "For people." Luke crouched beside him slowly. The words painted unevenly but carefully across the wood made him unexpectedly quiet. "Nobody sleeps outside here." Luke looked at the sign longer than expected. Because somehow, without anybody saying it out loud, that became true. Claire stepped out from the barn carrying folded blankets just in time to see his expression. "He has been working on it all week," she said softly. Luke nodded once, swallowing against something unexpectedly heavy settling in his chest. Not sadness exactly. Something gentler. Something closer to healing. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward Luke, resting against his leg the same way he used to years ago after difficult days overseas. Quiet comfort. Familiar loyalty. Luke scratched gently behind the old dog's ears. "You knew, did not you?" he muttered softly. Ranger only blinked once, calm as ever. Like answers no longer mattered much. Maybe instinct did. Maybe kindness did. Maybe lonely things simply found each other when they needed to most. That evening, sunlight stretched gold across the ranch while wind moved softly through tall grass, replacing old snow. Claire cooked dinner inside while Eli proudly nailed his sign near the barn entrance, Ranger supervising closely like always. Luke stood near the porch watching everything quietly. Watching life happen where silence once lived. Watching people who somehow stopped feeling temporary. Watching grief loosen enough to let something else grow beside it. Before bed, Eli stopped near the porch steps and looked up carefully. "Hey, Luke." Luke looked over. "Yeah." The boy hesitated for only a second. "Would it be okay if we stayed?" Honest question. Small voice. Big meaning. Luke looked toward the ranch. Toward the barn. Toward Ranger already asleep near the doorway like he solved this problem months ago. Then back toward Eli. "Kid," Luke answered quietly, "I think you already did." Later that night, mountain air settled calm beneath stars stretching wide over Colorado skies. Ranger slept peacefully near the barn entrance, old paws resting beside Eli's crooked wooden sign. Warm lights glowed softly inside the ranch house, while laughter drifted faintly through open windows. And for the first time in years, Luke Brennan no longer felt like somebody waiting for life to return. Because sometimes, the things people spend years searching for arrive quietly during snowstorms, asking only one simple question.